On the evening of September 9th, 1981, Chuck Hall drove home from work in Aurora, Illinois, back to the apartment on Shamrock Court where his wife Cheryl was waiting. He had even come home during his lunch break that day, and he had eaten with her, talked with her, and then gone back to his shift without a single reason to think that anything was wrong. But when he climbed the stairs to their apartment that evening just after 6:15 and stepped inside, what he found changed everything about the life he thought he was coming home to. Cheryl was dead. She was only 20 years old. She had been strangled using the cord from a household iron, and the cord had been pulled so tightly around her neck that it left deep marks pressed into her skin. She was hanging from a doorknob, wearing only a sweatshirt, and a pair of her shorts had been torn. Investigators took in all of that and understood fairly quickly that Cheryl had not simply been attacked, she had resisted. She had fought back against whoever came through that door, and the physical evidence in that apartment told a story about a young woman who refused to go quietly. The conclusion investigators reached was that someone had come to that apartment that afternoon with intentions Cheryl had rejected, and that she had been killed because of it. Chuck Hall had kissed his wife goodbye after lunch. He had gone back to work, finished his shift, and come home to find her gone in the worst possible way, and nobody, including the police who responded to that apartment that evening, could yet say with any certainty who had done it. To understand what happened that afternoon, it helps to know a little about the world Cheryl and Chuck had built for themselves by the fall of 1981. Cheryl Lynn Hall was 20 years old, working at a local bank in Aurora, and the two of them had settled into an apartment on the 1600 block of Shamrock Court, a quiet residential area that was, by every measure, an ordinary place for a young couple starting out. They had a routine, a social circle of neighbors and acquaintances they had gotten to know over time, and among those acquaintances was a man named Larry Galloway. Galloway was not a stranger to them. He was someone who had been in their home more than once, someone they had sat across from at a card table and spent relaxed evenings with, and there was nothing on the surface that made him stand out as a cause for concern. He was simply part of the wider circle of people the Halls knew, the kind of person you wave to and invite over without giving it a second thought. That easy familiarity, however, was exactly what gave Galloway something he eventually chose to misuse. About 8 weeks before Cheryl was killed, Galloway showed up at the apartment alone. He had not come to see Chuck, and what made the visit so unsettling, in hindsight, was that he had clearly calculated his timing. He knew Chuck had a regular work schedule, and he also knew something specific about Cheryl's week, that Wednesdays were her regular day off from the bank. He arrived at the apartment aware that she would be there by herself, and whatever happened during that visit left Cheryl feeling genuinely threatened. She had let him in because she knew him, because he was a familiar face, but something about the way he behaved that day crossed a line she felt in her gut. She had not forgotten about it. Those 8 weeks between that visit and September 9th had not smoothed it over or made it feel less significant. If anything, it had stayed with her, sitting somewhere in the back of her mind as something unresolved. And then he came back. The afternoon of September 9th unfolded the way most of Cheryl's Wednesdays did, at least on the surface. Chuck had come home during his break. They had spent some time together, and then he went back to his job at the cable company. Sometime around 3:15 in the afternoon, Cheryl called her sister, and the two of them talked. Just a phone call that gets made not because anything important needs to be said, but simply because the connection is easy and comfortable. Neither of them had any reason to think it would be the last conversation they would ever have. By 6:15, when Chuck walked back through the front door, Cheryl was gone, and the window between that phone call and his return was where the entire tragedy had played out. Prosecutors would later piece together what they believed happened during those hours. Galloway, they argued, had come back to the apartment that Wednesday afternoon for the same reason he had come 8 weeks earlier, because he knew the schedule, because he knew Chuck would be away, and because he had intentions that Cheryl had already made clear she wanted no part of. He had used the cord from their iron to strangle her, pulling it tight enough to leave the kind of marks on her neck that investigators described as deep indentations. He had then left the apartment through a window. The torn shorts and the overall condition of the scene all pointed toward a struggle, toward Cheryl fighting back against what was being forced on her, and the physical evidence suggested she had managed to scratch or grab at her attacker in the process. Beneath the fingernails of Cheryl's left hand, investigators collected biological material. In 1981, DNA analysis as a forensic tool did not yet exist in any practical, usable form, and so those samples were documented, preserved, and filed away along with the rest of the physical evidence from the scene. Nobody in that department could have predicted that those fingernail scrapings would one day become the most important piece of the entire case. Aurora police moved through the investigation in the weeks that followed, and Larry Galloway was among the people they looked at closely from the beginning. He had a connection to the victim. He had been to the apartment before, and that visit he had made 8 weeks earlier, the one that had left Cheryl feeling unsettled and afraid, was not something investigators were prepared to overlook. When Cheryl's mother, Garnet Bailey, called Galloway approximately 2 weeks after the murder and told him plainly that he would eventually be held accountable for what he had done, his response was to tell her to bring it on and hang up the phone. That phone call would stay with the family for decades. But in 1981, investigators hit a wall. The physical evidence they had was limited by the technology available at the time, and while Galloway remained a suspect in the minds of police and in the hearts of Cheryl's family, the case did not move forward in the way anyone had hoped. The years began to pass, and for a long time, it seemed as though Cheryl Lynn Hall would become one of the countless cold cases that quietly collect dust in filing cabinets across the country, remembered by the people who loved her, but unreachable by the justice system that was supposed to deliver answers. What kept the case from disappearing entirely was the people who refused to let it go, the detectives who stayed on it, the family members who kept asking questions, and the slow, steady advance of forensic science that was changing what law enforcement could do with old evidence. By the early 2000s, DNA analysis had transformed the landscape of criminal investigation in ways that would have seemed almost impossible to those Aurora officers who first walked into Cheryl's apartment in 1981. Cold cases that had sat untouched for decades were suddenly being reopened because the technology now existed to extract meaningful information from biological evidence that was years, sometimes decades old. Aurora police began taking a serious second look at Cheryl's case, and at the center of that second look was the biological material that had been preserved from under her fingernails all those years ago. The challenge they faced was twofold. First, they needed to get a DNA sample from Larry Galloway, who had never been charged in connection with Cheryl's death and who had no obvious reason to voluntarily provide one. Second, they needed to do it in a way that could hold up legally and would not compromise the integrity of any future prosecution. What they came up with was the kind of patient, methodical police work that does not make for dramatic television, but that, in practice, takes real skill and persistence to pull off. Detectives John Munn and Sergeant Matt Thomas, both of the Aurora Police Department, developed a plan to obtain Galloway's DNA without him knowing. They followed him to a restaurant and waited. When Galloway finished his meal and left, police retrieved the straw he had used from his glass, bagged it, and sent it to the lab. It was August of 2008, 27 years after Cheryl's death, and those investigators had just collected what they hoped would finally be enough to bring her case to a close. The results that came back from the lab were significant, but not without complications. Galloway's DNA profile was compared against the biological material collected from under Cheryl's fingernails, and the comparison produced a match on 9 out of 13 analysis points. 2 of the points were inconclusive, and on the remaining 2, the DNA sample had degraded to the point where no meaningful comparison could be made. Prosecutors were careful in how they described those results, noting that it would not be entirely accurate to call it a definitive match, but that the DNA was consistent with Galloway's profile in a way that the defense would have to answer for in court. For investigators who had been carrying this case for nearly 3 decades, it was as close to confirmation as they had ever come. Galloway was arrested in August of 2008 and charged with first-degree murder. He had been living in Aurora the whole time. He was working as a conductor for Metra, the commuter rail service in the Chicago metropolitan area, and by all outward appearances, he had simply gone on with his life for the better part of 3 decades while Cheryl's family lived with the consequences of what he had done. The road from Galloway's arrest to a resolution in court took several more years, and the path it took was not a straightforward one. The prosecution prepared to take the case to trial on first-degree murder charges, while the defense began examining the evidence from a different angle. The question of whether a jury in 2012 could be asked to fairly evaluate physical evidence that had been collected in 1981 under standards and procedures that bore little resemblance to the forensic protocols of the modern era. Both sides understood the risk that came with that dynamic, and both sides were, in the words of the defense attorney David Kamek, concerned about the tension between 1981 evidence collection and 21st century analysis methods. Galloway had been placed on electronic home monitoring while the case moved through the court system, and in the days leading up to the scheduled trial date, something shifted. He had been facing up to 40 years in prison if the case went before a jury and ended in a first-degree murder conviction. And the prosecution had made an offer that even his own defense attorney acknowledged was exceptionally favorable given the circumstances. The offer was for Galloway to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter, a charge that had existed under Illinois law in 1981 and that today would be considered roughly equivalent to second-degree murder. The sentence that came with that plea was 10 years in prison, and under the sentencing guidelines that applied at the time of the offense, Galloway would be required to serve approximately 5 of those years, minus the 22 days he had already spent in custody since his arrest. On the morning the trial was set to begin, Galloway stood in Kane County Court before Judge David Aikman and entered his guilty plea. He had no visible reaction as the plea was accepted and the sentence handed down. He made no statement to the court, offered no explanation for what he had done, and said nothing to Cheryl's family, who were sitting in that courtroom and had waited 31 years to watch someone hold him accountable. Cheryl's mother, Garnet Bailey, had driven to that courthouse carrying 31 years of grief and a memory that had never faded. The sound of Galloway's voice on the other end of the phone telling her to bring it on, all those years ago, before hanging up. She watched him be led away to prison and said afterward that while the sentence was not nearly as long as she believed it should be, there was something undeniable about the fact that he did not walk out of that courtroom a free man. She had spent 3 decades believing that justice would eventually catch up with him, and in the way that it can sometimes feel both satisfying and insufficient at the same time, it finally had. Chuck Hall, who had walked into that apartment 31 years earlier and found his young wife dead, was also present for the plea. He wanted to know why. Not in a legal sense, not for the record, but in the way that the people left behind by sudden, violent death always want to know why. Because the crime itself answers nothing about the thing that made it possible in the first place. Galloway never gave him that. The guilty plea meant there was no trial, no testimony, no moment in which Galloway was forced to sit in a witness box and explain the choices he had made on that September afternoon. Chuck Hall left the courthouse knowing that the man responsible was going to prison, but carrying the same unanswered question he had carried for 3 decades. Kane County State's Attorney Joe McMahon spoke to the press after the hearing and acknowledged the difficulty of the decision the prosecution had made. He talked about the incomplete nature of the DNA evidence, about the challenge of presenting testimony about events that had happened more than 30 years earlier, and about the reality that a guilty plea, even to a lesser charge, represented a form of accountability that a lost trial could not. He said, plainly, that no decision short of going to trial and getting the maximum sentence would have felt entirely right, and that the prosecution had weighed everything in front of them and made the call they believed served justice in the most reliable way. The defense attorney's position, stated publicly, was that the prosecution's offer had been so favorable that a defendant in Galloway's position could not reasonably have turned it down, and he was careful to note that he was not suggesting Galloway had not committed the crime. What he was describing was the arithmetic of risk that every defense attorney has to work through when their client is facing decades in prison and the evidence, however imperfect, points in one direction. The detectives who had pursued the case, John Munn and Matt Thomas, received praise from the state's attorney's office and from Cheryl's family for the patience and creativity they had brought to an investigation that most people might have assumed was beyond recovery. The decision to follow Galloway, wait for him to leave a usable DNA sample behind, and then build a case from that starting point required the kind of commitment to an old case that is, unfortunately, not always easy to come by in departments managing large caseloads. The family made clear that without those 2 officers, the case might never have moved at all. There is a version of this story where the evidence collected from Cheryl's fingernails in 1981 simply disappears into a storage room and is never examined again, and where Larry Galloway goes on working as a train conductor in the Chicago suburbs until he retires, living an unremarkable life while the woman he killed remains a name on an unsolved case file. That version of the story very nearly happened. The distance between that outcome and the one that actually occurred is essentially the distance between the detectives who kept pressing and the technology that eventually made pressing worthwhile. What the Cheryl Lynn Hall case illustrates, in the clearest possible terms, is something that investigators and prosecutors have come to understand over the past few decades of cold case work, that old evidence, preserved carefully and re-examined with new tools, can carry information that was always there but simply could not be read at the time. The biological material under Cheryl's fingernails had been sitting in evidence storage for 27 years, and embedded in it, in a form that 1981 technology could not interpret, was a connection to the man who killed her. She had scratched him, or grabbed at him, or held on in some way during that struggle. And in doing so, she had preserved something that the science of her time could not use, but that the science of a later era eventually could. Galloway served his sentence and was released. The charge he pleaded to, voluntary manslaughter, was never the charge that Cheryl's family believed reflected the full weight of what he had done. And Chuck Hall's words outside that courthouse captured what many of them felt, that the time served was not enough, that it would never fully account for the life that was taken and the decades that followed without her in them. Those feelings are entirely understandable and entirely human, and they sit alongside the fact that Galloway did ultimately stand in a courtroom, enter a guilty plea, and go to prison for killing Cheryl Lynn Hall, which is more than many families of cold case victims ever get. Garnet Bailey, who had spent 31 years waiting, said afterward that she was not a gambler and that a short amount of time was better than nothing at all, and that watching Galloway leave that courtroom in handcuffs rather than as a free man felt, in its own complicated way, like the answer to the phone call she had made 2 weeks after her daughter's death. When she told him he would eventually pay and he told her to bring it on. She had brought it on. It just took 31 years. Cheryl Lynn Hall was 20 years old on the last afternoon of her life. She had a job she went to, a husband she came home to, a sister she talked to on the phone, and a routine that was entirely ordinary in the best possible way. She did not get to be any older than that, and the person responsible for that spent the better part of 3 decades living freely in the same city where he had killed her. The cold case system is imperfect. The justice that eventually arrived was imperfect, and the sentence that was handed down was imperfect. But somewhere inside all of that imperfection is the fact that the evidence Cheryl left behind on that September afternoon in 1981 was strong enough, even 30 years later, to bring her case to an end. If you have thoughts on cases like this one, on cold case investigations, on DNA evidence, and the way it has changed what justice looks like for families who wait decades for answers, leave them in the comments. Cases like Cheryl's are not uncommon, and the question of whether the outcome was truly just is one that reasonable people continue to disagree about.